Okay. Hello, everyone. I'm Dr. Justin Essery. I'm an assistant professor at Rice University. Welcome to the International Methods Colloquium. The International Methods Colloquium is a periodic online interactive seminar discussion on the application of quantitative statistical methodology to the social sciences, sponsored by Rice University and by the National Science Foundation. This week's speaker is Sarah Boucher from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and her talk is entitled Engaging Experts, Dealing with Divergent Elicited Priors in Political Science. Sarah's talk will last between 30 to 40 minutes, after which point we will take questions from the audience. You may email questions to methods.colloquium@gmail.com, but I recommend that you ask a question using the Zoom Q&A button that appears at the bottom of the webinar window. And that's especially true for viewers outside the United States because we receive the questions in the Q&A box immediately, no matter where you are. A link to Sarah's paper and her slideshow will be available in the Zoom webinar chat window as soon as I get done saying this little thing, so that you can refer to it throughout your presentation. And now I'd like to welcome Sarah to the IMC. Sarah, welcome.
Great, thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here today and to talk a little bit about the ways in which we use expert information in political science research and the ways that we could do that better, specifically through an elicited priors approach. And I'll talk about what that means. So, like I'm saying, I'm motivated by this question of how an elicited priors approach can be better integrated into social scientific research and contribute and allow us to better evaluate information in statistical analyses. And by elicited priors, if you're not familiar, what I mean is using the substantive knowledge of experts, whether through interviews with those experts or through published research that they've conducted, that allows us to improve the accuracy of posterior estimates in Bayesian analysis. So this is in contrast to what's become really popular in Bayesian analysis recently, which is what's called objective priors or uninformative priors, which is basically saying, trying not to impose too much opinion or prior information on the data as you're doing the analysis. I'm suggesting here we could take a step back and that elicited priors are a way to instead impose better information on top of that data in order to improve our posterior estimates by relying on the insights of people who know a lot about the subject matter that we're trying to understand. So in particular, my substantive motivations for being engaged in this research come from the sort of moving frontier of comparative politics research into authoritarian and developing countries, both of which I'm calling low information environments. And what I mean by that is that the data are missing not at random often, or they're intentionally obscured by people who would prefer their true intentions not be known. And that has a couple of different impacts. So one of the impacts that that has is on strategic behavior of actors in those political contexts. So especially because that creates an asymmetric information environment, the ways in which people engage with power are very different than if you had a more open information environment. But it also impacts our ability to conduct analyses of political outcomes and objectives in those environments because we now have sort of two correlated sources of distortion, one where the information is simply not being made available and the other where individuals are conducting behavior on the basis of that non-available or available information. And right now the literature is set up to address sort of methodological and substantive concerns with that issue somewhat separately. So on the one hand, we have really great evaluations of what direct censorship looks like this King, Pan, and Roberts paper studying China, basically trying to figure out what's causing the missingness or what leads to missingness in that case. And we also have really great formal theoretic works, such as this Acemoglu paper from 2011, that's investigating the structure of the information environment and how sources can be thought of as credible or as distributing knowledge throughout networks. In environments like you might find under authoritarianism. But what those approaches don't let us do is get at the, so they let us on the one hand get at the sort of substantive issues of saying, you know, in these environments, the information environment is skewed. How is it skewed? How do we know that it's skewed? What impacts does that have on people on the ground? But in terms of taking that up one level from a methodological perspective, it doesn't give us a lot of insights into how to correct that issue, particularly when gathering more information in those environments is subject to the same kinds of constraints of skewness or of missingness. And so I'm going to talk a little bit through an example of what exactly I mean and what that would look like, and how an elicited priors approach might actually lead us to a solution. So this is an empirical application, an example from some of my other work that's investigating what motivates participation in authoritarian legislatures. So the idea is that, authoritarians are creating these legislatures and they're trying to solve information problems or commitment problems. So they're trying to figure out, what the opposition wants, or they're trying to figure out how loyal their people really are. But given that that's happening, what would explain variation in legislators' use of that forum? So, a lot of people think that it's a function of them balancing career objectives and policy preferences. So, for example, I, as a member of parliament, an MP, might want to pander to a ruling party that's mostly in control in order to secure a future career in the government. Or I might have policy preferences about things like education or agriculture, and I want to staunchly defend those and figure out how to make a way forward for policy change. So I'm having to weigh those two different aspects of my incentives at any given time. And it's important how MPs do things like this because it gives an opportunity to facilitate endogenous institutional change or persistence. And it also has implications like Milewski and Schuler showed in their 2010 paper on Vietnam for what meaningful representation looks like in an authoritarian regime. So all of that said, I took data from the Myanmar context, so 438 observations of members of parliament between 2011 and 2013 of their questions to particular area ministers. And this is from the lower house, the Pitulotto. And I'm trying to investigate what gives rise to that participation as a function of the demographic characteristics of those MPs. And so this is very much in line with what Milewski and Schuler did in 2010. But it turns out that if you just go through sort of basic data analysis with this, and you start to look at your dependent variable, so in this case, the number of questions that members of parliament asked of ministers, if you log that dependent variable and add a small constant so that you can graph it, it shows evidence of bimodality, and that's true whether you use Milewski and Schuler's Vietnam data or my Myanmar data. And so previously, the way this had been modeled was using a negative binomial. So obviously the authors were aware that there's over-dispersion in the data because a lot of people don't talk at all, and then that one guy, he's going to talk 14 times, and so there's over-dispersion. We treat it with a negative binomial instead of a Poisson. What this is showing, though, is that there's zero-driven over-dispersion. That is, that it's all of the zeros that are adding up that's causing that over-dispersion in the first place. And what it looks like here is sort of a hurdle process or a dual data generating process for those zeros. And what I mean by that is that you can see this one sort of hump here on the left, and that's saying, there are some people who are going to speak or not going to speak. And then this other hump here on the right, there are some people who, having spoken, will speak more or will speak less. And so we want to incorporate that dual data generating process because it's telling us that within the body of members of parliament, there are going to be some people who are always zeros, who never ever speak, and some people who are sometimes zeros, who will eventually or occasionally speak, and their behavior would be really interesting. So to get at that, we're evaluating what looks like a relatively simple model here. So the number of questions asked as a function of the age, the sex, the prior career, the ethnicity, and the party of the particular members of parliament. But now we have a really complicated model with 438 observations and several factor variables that we have to deal with. And it is possible to estimate this in a Bayesian context with enough iterations, you can do it too. And so we have results both for the zero side here and for the count side. And you're seeing some interesting results. So you're seeing that people who previously had careers in the civil service are more likely to speak, but that people in educated professions are even more likely to speak. Whereas people from the ruling party, it overlaps zero in the highest point of the posterior density, but people in the ruling party don't look either more or less likely to speak, which is interesting from all of the conjecture about how pandering would work here. But what you notice at the same time are these pathologies of the estimation process. So we have these really long tails on some of these posterior densities. And what that's showing us is that we have some separation in the model that we're trying to contend with. So situations where essentially one individual is one particular combination of all of those different factors. They're 35 years old, they're a woman, they are in the USDP, and they previously were a farmer, and they only spoke 13 times. And no one else shares those same characteristics. So the model believes it can perfectly predict what an individual with those characteristics are likely to do, and vice versa. And those are things that you can control to some extent with an informed prior. So basically saying, okay, we only have one observation of this at this moment in time, but in general, our expectations of an individual in that position are the following, and allow us to sort of zoom in and look at a very particular part of the posterior density and to control that separation a little bit better. And I should say that this model is conducted even with relatively informed priors, so with a Cauchy 0 to 2.5, as suggested by Andy Gilman. And even so, you're getting separation in the model. And you also see similar sort of pathologies like this kind of bimodality on the intercept on the count side of the model, even though it's not quite so pathological. And at the same time, we're seeing things that are interesting to note. So, people who are from an ethnic minority, who have given that they've spoken, they're less likely to speak more. So we're learning insights about this process here, but at the same time, we're being tripped up by the pathology that appears just in the modeling process as a function of the fact that we have so few observations and such a complex model to have to estimate. And so how would we go about doing this if we wanted to do it with elicited priors? We wanted to get priors that were even better and sort of hone in on that. So this is an example of a survey that, this is a draft, it's not how it's actually going to go out, but that I'm conducting currently on exactly this question with exactly this issue. And so to experts, you basically pose a question. You say a member of parliament is a member of the USDP, which is the former ruling party. They're ethnically Burmese, and they previously served in the military. And now this survey setup is actually a roulette setup. So we're giving people chips to sort of bet on what they think the outcome is. And what they'll actually end up doing for us in the survey context is creating a prior density on all of these things. So for example, you would give them 10 chips. Each chip is worth 10%. So that if they thought that there was a 20% chance that someone with those characteristics spoke 2 times, they would move the slider on 2 up to 2. And the same thing until all of their chips are gone. And that lets us get a prior density. It does raise issues though, or questions though, about who these experts might be that we could use the knowledge of. And it raises another particular question given the authoritarian context in a way that, as I said previously, is not addressed in the literature of understanding like this missingness or obscuring of data, is that people are likely in this context to have very divergent opinions about what the data generating process is. So one person might look at this prompt and say, well, because they're ethnically Burmese, they're in the majority, and they're a member of the former ruling party who wants to maintain their power against the NLD, Aung San Suu Kyi's party, and they previously served in the military, they're likely to be a person who is a patsy. And so they'll speak a ton because they just want to shower praise on the regime and make sure that they ensure their continued place in authority. Another person might say, well, they previously served in the military and they're already in the USDP, so all they need to do is just sit down and shut up and they will be safe. They won't say anything accidentally incriminating and their position is already secure. So we have 2 legitimate but completely different views of what is likely to happen, and that would influence the way that each of those 2 hypothetical position experts would play a game of roulette like this. And so the question is, how do we go about addressing that divergence of opinion? And is there a roadmap for letting us do that and still incorporate this expert knowledge? So to recap, the applications for an elicited priors approach are applications that are benefited by a Bayesian approach in general. So ones where you have sparse data, so authoritarian or less developed contexts, you have a high degree of variation, or you have a very complex modeling structure. And it's great on the one hand because you have the option to incorporate both qualitative and quantitative approaches. So really engaging experts who, previously, especially in authoritarian countries, qualitative researchers have done a ton of work, a ton of ethnographic work, and have a lot of knowledge on the ground about how things operate that we can incorporate into our newly emerging data sets about political processes. On the other hand, though, guidance about how to do that and implement an elicited priors approach is actually relatively limited. And it's a blessing and a curse because priors can play a really significant role, especially in these challenging modeling exercises that are becoming increasingly popular in comparative politics. And so in terms of the literature and where does it lead us on how to actually conduct an approach like this, unfortunately, there's limited adoption of elicited priors approaches in all fields, even though Gill and Walker had this great paper in 2005 that kind of laid out a roadmap for how we might use elicited priors in political science. But here it's over 10 years on, and there's still not many who actually engage in this. And there are a couple different reasons for that. One is that it can be difficult and time-consuming to actually do an elicited priors approach. So often these have been conducted not as surveys, but as focus groups or in one-on-one interviews, and in processes that are iterative, where a researcher will elicit a prior and then fit the distribution and then check with the expert, make sure it reflects what they wanted, and if not, go back, tweak it, make it a little bit better, etc. That's just the first one-on-one. And then they're going to a group of experts and saying, here are all of these opinions that we have to consolidate them in some way and figure out what's going on. So in a focus group setting, effectively having experts talk it out until they can come up with what's called a consensus prior. So that makes things very difficult to implement. And at the same time, there's also this, in the background, this looming general skepticism of subjective Bayesian approaches. So as I mentioned before, currently in Bayesian analyses, it's most common to see an objective prior, and this is directly advocating a subjective prior. So basically inserting more bias into the equation, but here we're saying it's informed. And in some ways, it's more honest to the process that's going on, because it's not the case that an uninformed or an objective prior is actually uninformed or objective. It's actually a strong positive statement that we don't have any information about what the relationship between an independent variable and a dependent variable might be. And most of the time, that's simply not true. We have lots of published research that we can draw on, and we can really leverage those insights to get better posterior estimates. So there are some applications in scientific fields, so especially the natural and the biological sciences, as well as medicine. But there are a couple of problems with directly importing the approach that those disciplines use into a social science context. And first and foremost, they have a very circumscribed view of expertise. So these are settings where they're relying on what I call credentialed experts. So in the medical field, people who have MDs, who have been in private practice for 10 or 20 years, who are board certified, et cetera, et cetera. So these are individuals who are likely to have some kind of consensus opinion about what the best course of action would be. So often in their hypotheticals, it's saying, similar to our MP case, an individual who is of this age presents with these symptoms. What is the % chance that they will recover if administered this drug? And often the training that medical professionals get would lead them to very similar conclusions about what those expected probabilities would be. So commonly in those fields, when they're using priors from multiple individuals, they'll get a consensus prior to begin with, or they'll just average the priors that they did get, because presumably sort of the data generating process for the expertise is the same, because it's coming from your training as a medical professional. And so any variation is just sort of noise in that mindset, which is very different from the circumstance that I presented in the Myanmar case, where you have two seemingly really legitimate concepts of how things might go down, and you need to figure out a way to either pick one or incorporate both. The other thing that they do is they place a lot of emphasis on the validity of individual priors with respect to the data. So like I said, eliciting a prior, forming the distribution, checking to see if that looks reasonable given the data that we have. If not, tweak it a little bit, talk to the expert again, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a lot of emphasis on making sure that the individual priors are really precise, but not so much emphasis on seeking out a body of expertise that's actually going to help us answer our question and is going to incorporate the diversity of perspectives that we might need in order to understand what's truly going on. So I painted that picture, but even in the hard sciences and medicine, they harbor differences of opinion. So I picked up this comic of policy review at Johns Hopkins, presumably university. And you know, the first two panels are giving you these impressions. So the first guy is saying, it's my belief that heart disease shouldn't be treated with open heart surgery, but leeches. And the reviewer instantly shuts him down and says, no, not if you want to keep your job. But by the time we make it to the third panel, this individual says that he believes transgender patients are just sexual deviants and they shouldn't be given any treatments by the medical community. And the reviewer is saying, sure, fine, whatever, your academic freedom. So the point here is that there are still contentious debates, even within the medical sciences and the hard sciences, about what kinds of things are going on. And on the one hand, you could treat some of those positions as overly extreme and exclude them. Or on the other hand, because the debate is still currently contentious, you might want to include those kinds of positions and see what effect they have on your posterior estimates and whether in fact they look reasonable. So not in a caricature style such as this, but the point being reasonable differences of opinion about the course of action or the course of treatment that's supposed to be undertaken still exist in the medical community. And the current methods for elicited priors that they're using don't have any tools to encompass those differences of opinion. And so I'm proposing a new methodology for how exactly to do that, and it's a Dirichlet-based approach. So this Dirichlet-based approach is basically getting you that integration of divergent priors without relying on averaging or consensus priors directly. And so what you're doing is you're essentially, getting all of your experts and you're asking them a certain number of questions given the number of covariates that you're interested in estimating. And the Dirichlet process is going to go within that information and find latent groupings within the experts. So like basically latent points of consensus that exist and group experts into clusters, so that you then, the researcher, can see those clusters and can see what kinds of consensus points exist and what individuals don't exist within consensus points. So if you want to think about what the Dirichlet process is actually doing, it's operating by analogously a Chinese restaurant process. So if you've ever been to a Chinese restaurant for dim sum, there are lots of big circular tables. And you can imagine that customers are coming in succession. So the first customer will sit at the first table. And the second customer, there's some probability that they'll sit at the first table, which is a higher probability because someone is already seated there. And there's some probability that they'll sit at another table, and so on as continued patrons come into the Chinese restaurant. And so that's sort of how these clusters are being populated, where you can imagine that the number of tables here is actually infinite. So that's one of the things that's an advantage of using a Dirichlet process in particular, rather than k-means or other kinds of clustering, is that we don't have to specify the number of clusters ahead of time. There could technically be infinite clusters. And it also means that if we add additional experts in to our analysis after the fact, there's a chance that there's going to be a new cluster discovered. So just saying what that would look like for the previous example with Myanmar, effectively what you're getting is you're saying your dependent variable is some function of these shape parameters and then our x's that already existed, but our count and zero betas are now subset by cluster that was determined by the Dirichlet process. And the Dirichlet process itself has this alpha shape parameter, which has a couple of different conditions. So the first is m over n, which is the number of questions that you're asking experts over the number of experts that exist. And so effectively, we're breaking down a relatively complicated model even further and saying each of these betas can be put within an individual cluster to reflect an expert's opinion about what the direct relationship is between that explanatory variable and the dependent variable. So if you want to just see what that clustering process looks like, I have a couple of simulations that will change depending upon the number of experts that you're engaging, the number of questions that you ask them, and the number of covariates that you're trying to estimate. So on the left-hand side, you'll see an estimated probability of experts being in the same cluster, and you can compare that to the right-hand side, which is the truth of whether they're in the same cluster or not. And in these plots, if you're in a turquoise square, you do share a cluster with the expert on the opposite axis. If you're in a dark gray square, you do not share that cluster. And if you're in a light gray square or a light turquoise square, it's unsure whether you share that cluster with another expert. And so effectively the way to read it is you can usually go along the diagonal. So here, each of these boxes is showing us that expert 1 shares a cluster with expert 1, expert 2 shares a cluster with expert 2, but expert 2 is sharing that cluster with all of these other individuals as well. And so with 10 questions and 10 covariates, even with 20 experts, we do pretty well actually at sorting people into clusters. But that's not the case if with just 10 experts, we're asking a lot more questions relative to the number of covariates that we have. So in this setup, we only have 4 covariates, but we're asking 15 questions, where 15 questions look like what I showed you previously in that survey slide of a hypothetical with hypothetical values or hypothetical ranges of independent variables and asking for a prediction on the dependent variable. And so effectively what's going on here is you're swamping the model with a lot of information that it has to sort through in a certain number of iterations in order to slot experts into those clusters. And we can see that it does better if we take that number of questions down from 15 to 10. So it's not perfect. You're still asking a lot of questions relative to the number of covariates, but there's much less uncertainty in these areas than there was on the previous slide, where you have a significant amount of light gray and light turquoise. So having convinced you, I hope, that the Dirichlet process actually does a good job of sorting experts into clusters as a function of what they're asking them and what we're trying to estimate, I want to show you what that would look like in a hands-on application. And in particular, using the data from the Western and Jackman paper in 1994, where effectively what they're doing is they're illustrating that we can apply Bayesian priors in comparative politics, and that we can use those differing priors that people have to adjudicate the different possible or the range of possible coefficients that we should expect on variables that we care about. So they're leveraging this standing debate between Stevens and Wallerstein, who are experts, by the way. And using that to assess differing model estimates. So basically, if Wallerstein were right, these would be your model estimates. If Stevens were right, these would be your model estimates. Their model is relatively simple. So the application that they're looking at is studying unionization in industrialized democracies. So on the dependent variable, you have an increase in unionization as a proportion. On the right-hand side, you have 3 sort of candidate explanations. One is that you would have a leftist government. So you can imagine that they then would support unionization efforts. The second is log labor force. So basically the idea is that as the labor force increases, you're less likely to get unionization in some circles. And finally, economic concentration, which almost literally is just industrialization. So the level of concentration that you have in the economy. And in order to demonstrate those results just on this simple OLS model, they're using data from 20 industrialized nations, but a single year snapshot, meaning the N of this study is 20. So it's starting to look a little bit, even though it's about industrialized countries where we supposedly have better information, it's starting to look a little bit like these circumstances that are so hard to estimate now with less developed countries and with authoritarian settings where our data are relatively sparse. And even though this model is not particularly complicated, you couldn't make it much more complicated and still hope to estimate it. So in order to make this a little bit more fun and to illustrate the method, well, first I'll say these are just the 2 baseline priors that we're working with, so Wallerstein and Stevens. And they don't differ on a ton of dimensions. So in terms of their beliefs about the intercept, that's left out. In terms of left government, they don't seem to particularly care. The big difference is that Wallerstein thinks that as the labor force increases, unionization would decrease. And Stevens believes that as economic concentration increases, unionization should increase. And I should say that for each of these, Western and Jackman are taking these priors from published sources and sort of imposing what they think would be a prior mean and a prior variance onto each of these things. So they're not directly given in any particular work, and they're not coming from interviews. So they might not be precise, but are meant to be sort of signboards for what a person holding a Stevens or a Wallerstein position might actually say. Okay, so to spice things up a little bit, and to demonstrate this with a clustering method, I'm suggesting that we recruit an additional 8 experts who have slightly different opinions. And here on this graph, it's showing the prior mean in the dot, and the precision that's given by it is with the color. So anything with a turquoise circle is going to have high precision versus the gray ones, which have low precision. So in addition to Wallerstein and Stevens, we have several experts. So we have someone who's what I'm calling an economic skeptic. They have a similar position to Wallerstein and Stevens on the left government issue, but are skeptical about the role of economic concentration, unlike Stevens. We have 2 different kinds of communists. We have one who's much more statist, who thinks that if we had a left government, then unionization would be supported and everything would improve. And we have a second one who believes that we need to increase the size of the proletariat and the working force in order to get increased unionization. Following them, we have roughly a neoliberal who thinks that left government harms things, economic concentration should decrease things because it increases competition, and doesn't particularly care about the size of the labor force. I added in 2 uncertain individuals. So these are individuals who, especially in an authoritarian setting or a less developed country setting, you might have been told are experts at this, or they are privy to particular information, but perhaps they don't feel comfortable sharing it with you, or perhaps they're not entirely sure how to instantiate the knowledge that they have in the sort of statistical process that you've laid out before them. So we have a couple of those, and they only differ in their position on left government. So they're right on either side of the 0 line. And then we have a couple people who think labor is the main explanation, and they only differ in terms of how large they think the magnitude is for log labor force increasing unionization. So we have a lot of different experts with a lot of different priors that could be imposed on these data. And effectively what we're going to do is a comparison between a Dirichlet process method and an averaging approach to each of these. So doing that comparison, the intercepts are going to be exactly the same because the intercepts for all experts, both from the original paper and from what I imposed, are just set to 0 and have large variance. But there are differences in terms of left government, log labor, and economic concentration. So on left government, you'll notice that the Dirichlet process is actually the posterior mean that you get, and the precision is very similar to the high precision prior means of Stevens and Wallerstein, who in this case share a cluster. Whereas in the averaging scenario, that posterior mean is much less and is giving more weight to the neoliberal and to the communists, and in particular, Communist 2, who's in a cluster by herself. In a cluster by herself, and therefore a little bit more contained in the Dirichlet process setup. Similarly with log labor, labor 1 and 2, those 2 experts get a little bit more weight in the Dirichlet process because they partially share a cluster, and that's not reflected in the posterior mean of the averaging approach, although the posterior means of the 2 are similar. And then on the economic concentration front, it might look like a very extreme difference, but that 95% credible interval actually encompasses, on the averaging, actually encompasses the one from the Dirichlet process. So it's not immediately obvious that they're that different. But what I will say is that the Dirichlet process 1 does recover that 0 posterior mean, which was very close to most of the prior means. Whereas for the averaging one, it's being pushed by some of the extreme views that were introduced. So just by way of some conclusions, I'm going to talk about a couple of extensions that I'm doing with this, and I'm more than open to questions and comments and suggestions on all of it. But to continue some of this work, I intend to work with simulated priors, both with OLS and Probit, and to continue to compare the Dirichlet process with pooling and averaging approaches. So I didn't include pooling here because it will depend on the weights that a researcher chooses, which is not something that I can easily replicate multiple different times. What I will say is that the way that this Dirichlet process was set up was to have equal weights for all the clusters, but one of the advantages is its flexibility. So you could easily set unequal weights to those things, particularly through a hyperprior. So if I, as a researcher, were conducting these interviews and I felt as though some individual was not really giving me the most accurate information, or they seemed to be reticent about the process, I might downweight the opinion that they ultimately gave me or whatever cluster it was seated within. On the other hand, I might decide to give it more weight or to leave it at an equal weight because I think that whatever it is that they're trying to communicate must be particularly incisive information. So leaving it up to the researcher, but making it transparent at the same time. I'm working on, as I mentioned, directly eliciting priors for the Myanmar case, so both in that survey that I showed you and via standard methods in person. Also working on elicitation with American experts through online surveys, and that's in joint work with Alex Talk. And then finally, working on some elicitation from credible print and online sources. So in particular, to attempt to do two things. One, to validate the priors that we're eliciting from individuals with what sort of a consensus is or what is previously published, and attempting to see how different those two things are. And the other is attempting to more rigorously do what Jackman and Western did in their 94 paper and try to come up with a way to correctly get or elicit priors out of published works, because there isn't any sort of guide for how exactly to do that. And so just to wrap up, I'm hoping that this work will do a couple of different things. I'm hoping that it will consider expertise to be a broader category. So allowing us to incorporate many more divergent opinions means that I can go to Myanmar and ask a man on the street what his opinion is, the same as I could go and ask a government official, and not be too worried about having to incorporate those potentially divergent opinions into my analysis. I also think that it would be very benefiting from the knowledge and the experience of qualitative scholars who, like I mentioned, have experience in these sort of new frontier areas that comparative politics is getting into. It also allows us to evaluate expert opinions interrelatedly rather than independently just with respect to the data like it's currently done in the sciences, and hopefully to treat the truth with a little bit more complexity. So rather than, as is the case implicitly in the averaging setup, thinking that some people are right and some people are wrong and I just need to get the right information out of someone and use it as my prior, rather thinking each of these individuals is likely to have a piece of the information. And so I want to puzzle together the whole picture, or as much of the picture as I can, in order to best inform the data analysis that I'm going to do. And that's all I have.
Okay. Let me try my video here. Okay. Thank you, Sarah, for that presentation. At this point, Sarah Boucher is available to take questions from the audience. You can email questions to methods.colloquium@gmail.com. You can also ask a question using the Zoom Q&A button that appears at the bottom of the webinar window. For our viewers outside the United States, we recommend using the Q&A box to ensure that we receive your questions immediately. And while we're waiting for questions from the audience to come in, I have a few questions. So let me start off with the nature of the problem that's motivating this research. So you mentioned in your slides and in your talk that the issue is, it seems to be that when you show some sort of bundle of characteristics to an expert, they may decide to key on certain aspects of the bundle and not others. And so when you're comparing multiple experts, you're not just comparing, they may actually share the judgment on those individual aspects, but then change the weight with which they assign to which they assign those aspects. Is that right?
That's part of what might be going on. So I think that's implicitly the argument for why elicitation has typically been done in focus groups, is so that experts can be communicating with each other and saying like, oh, I actually wasn't thinking that was that important given that this, oh, do you think that's more important? Perhaps I should upweight it, something like that.
Well, so if that's not the main problem with combination, what's the main problem with combination?
So I think the main problem with combination, so combination across experts, is the, I guess, the scheme that you're going to use to aggregate the entire prior distribution that you've elicited. And so effectively, how you choose an aggregation tool is going to influence which information you as the researcher are taking from the whole information that was elicited to apply to your research. So if you're averaging, you're often privileging much more extreme positions, given that you've included them in your bundle within the actual estimation of your posterior distribution, which you wouldn't necessarily do in the Dirichlet process unless you thought for some reason that an individual with a very extreme position or a cluster with a very extreme position had sort of privileged information that should be more included.
So the reason to try to combine experts with a Dirichlet process instead of just averaging is to shrink extreme estimates? Or to shrink extreme priors?
No, I think that it has the potential to shrink extreme priors, but that's kind of a byproduct. I think the motivation for it is that it allows us to engage a greater series of opinions and incorporate them into the analysis in the first place. So like when Jackman and Western are doing this in their original paper, they're just showing one estimate for Wallerstein's prior and posterior, and one estimate for Stevens' prior and posterior, and saying, isn't that interesting? We can get very similar results with each of these. They're not too different. They are different on the coefficients that each says are important, et cetera. But in that setup where you don't combine anything, you don't have a strong way to then say like, okay, who's right, who has the right opinion. Whereas once you stick that in a Dirichlet process, you see that Wallerstein and Stevens actually share a cluster of approximately the same prior, that they have differing opinions about two of the covariates, but the one covariate that implicitly the Dirichlet process is suggesting is differentiating or matters is not one that they have strong opinions about. And so effectively, you were able to incorporate what we thought were very divergent opinions about the data generating process for unionization, and actually see that in terms of what the broad consensus is about how individuals think about these things, given the other experts that you might draw in, they're not all that different at all.
So, okay, so the motivation, it's not to shrink priors, extreme priors, and it's not to, what was the first thing I said? Oh, it's not because of the experts identify different sort of things as being important. It's to enable the identification, the sort of online identification, if you like that terminology, of similar opinions in a large group of experts. Mm-hmm. That's the motivation, so that you can sample a larger number of experts. And so the comparison is not really between Dirichlet and averaging. Then it would seem like the comparison is between Dirichlet and some other aggregation process, like you mentioned, k-means clustering, right? So why are we comparing it to averaging if we're trying to discover clusters?
So this process is meant to be in terms of, you can think about just the litany of what happens before you actually then use the aggregated prior to generate the estimates. Often priors are elicited from more than one expert, but typically there's sort of shrinkage or erasure of extreme opinions, divergent opinions, other opinions, too many opinions, by using either just an average, a straight average of what's going on, or getting a consensus prior to begin with. And I'm saying for certain sets of problems, that might be perfectly fine because you might not have any valid extreme opinions about what the data generating process is. But in an environment where everyone is sort of receiving information, receiving some correlated information about what the true state of the world is, each of those individuals actually has a part of the truth, and so you would like to be able to incorporate as many of them as possible. You could do that with averaging, but if some of them have extreme opinions, it's going to push your estimates in ways that it wouldn't push them if you have them constrained to clusters.
So the goal is to essentially take, instead of trying to combine all of the experts you ask into one probability distribution or separate them individually, to create groups, and then hopefully those groups have identifiable positions that you can compare. That's the objective. So is it the case that, going back to the beginning of the talk, you talked a little bit about authoritarian regimes having sort of hidden or obscured incentives to do certain things. For example, the members of the legislature have competing incentives to do things, and they're not necessarily going to tell you what those are, which suggests that the prior is sort of filling in for missing or distorted information. But then you transition into a discussion of like a hurdle process, right? So, some people don't participate at all, and others participate a lot. And so we need to figure out why some people don't participate at all and why some people participate a lot. So then we got to that. But then we ended up right before the methodology was talking about essentially perfect prediction, right? Which is an artifact of having too little data, or data that's too rich for the number of data points it has, right? If you have 3 people and 15 different aspects on them, you're predicting 3 data points with 15 characteristics is going to be a bad idea. So that's a pretty winding road through sort of the reason for using these priors. Which of those things is the most important, or are they all important, or what problem are we really trying to solve here?
So I think the ultimate one is the one that I finally mentioned, which is, regardless of the separation issues that are going on in that model, like even if you didn't have separation, you might want to use a more informed prior than just a generic informed prior, because it might lead you to better estimates given the information that we already know and have. But given that you're going to do that, there's no roadmap for how to sort of adjudicate between the 2 positions that I laid out about why individuals might be participating in any given way. And you might want to incorporate both of those analyses into the ultimate posterior estimation that you're trying to get at. That creation of those 2 different positions, I think, is an artifact, or what I'm trying to sort of argue, it's as you say, a bit of a winding road, is an artifact of the skewed or low information environment that exists in an authoritarian system, is that the incentives aren't clear and open, so people can't just make up their own minds and say, obviously it is this that is causing people to act this way. That makes perfect sense. Rather, they have differing opinions or differing perspectives based upon the position that they occupy in society and what information they've been privy to about how to include these things. And so the problem that the Dirichlet is fixing is primarily one of being able to incorporate multiple divergent views about the particular relationship between your independent and dependent variables, but it's contextualized in these authoritarian settings where the reason that we have all of those divergent opinions is inherent to the information structure itself. So the exact same thing that's giving rise to missingness in our data is likely to give rise to divergent opinions of our experts in terms of what they think the relationship is.
If we cut out the second bit, we cut out the actual observational data bit, and I wanted to know, every prompt is sort of a bundle of characteristics, right? So you're a legislator that has 5 or 6 different things that might be relevant to you. There are lots of methodologies that have been developed to try to essentially identify the total, or I'm sorry, the separate effect of each of those aspects of their identity on your ultimate sort of judgment of their identity. So the so-called conjoint experiments, right, where you throw a bunch of stuff at people and then you sort of separate out. You try to use various techniques to separate out what's important. Is there any role to play for, and that would really affect the design of your survey, right? That would affect how you actually asked your experts the question, right? You wouldn't give them actual people, you'd give them sort of composite people that had those aspects you were looking for, and then hopefully you could use a clever design to sort of extract from that design what they thought of each individual aspect. Is there any role to play for this, or are these totally different issues?
So I can see a completely alternative structure that attempts to do exactly what you're suggesting, and that rather than trying to, because what's happening with the clusters is you're getting clustering as a function of the entire prior distribution that was generated for a particular expert, but you could imagine breaking that down into its component parts and saying that some people have better information about the relationship between X1 and Y, and some people have better information about the relationship between X2 and Y. And so I could imagine a completely different structure that attempts to tackle things that way. I think the reason that I'm going with this survey instrument right now, so there's actually a group of social psychologists at Sheffield that has designed a series of ways to elicit priors, because as psychologists know, and I think your man on the street would know, it's incredibly difficult for humans to assess probabilities. And so trying to define sort of clever ways of asking the question or getting at prior probability distribution without running into all of these pitfalls about the ways that people are benchmarking their beliefs against some peg that was laid for them by the researcher, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that you could do something like that, but I think that it would have, I think the biggest thing is it would have fundamentally different theoretical underpinnings, because you would have to be able to design it with a prior in mind of what kinds of variables or what kinds of relationships are likely to be distinguishable among individuals' knowledge base.
I actually think there's another possible answer too, which could be quite interesting, which is that the door might swing the other way. And what I mean by that is you can imagine there being, I just want to preface it by saying, I am at best a dilettante, and at worst just a guy who's read some papers about these conjoint experiments, not even read them that closely, but sort of conditional on that ignorance. You can imagine, so maybe this has been done, but you can imagine there being in these conjoint experiments the same kind of uncertainty problems or disagreement problems, where when you're asking for the effect of something, there's actually heterogeneity in the population that you're sampling of these effects. And yeah, you can just do the standard thing and get an average treatment effect, and that's fine. But if you want to actually uncover the heterogeneity in these effects, you might be able to incorporate your basic ideas about the Dirichlet process into the estimation of these conjoint effects to extract clusters, right? To say, well, these kind of people have this effect, and these other kind of people have a different, there's a different effect of the treatment on them. So that I think that could be very interesting, sort of going the other direction, right? You're informing the conjoint prior people, or I'm sorry, the conjoint test people. But I have to sort of guess that somebody who studies these conjoint effects is going to see what you're doing and say, this sounds like what I'm doing, right? And why aren't you doing what I'm doing, right? There's got to be some reason why one of us is sort of making a mistake, or we're ignoring something, or what. It is a different theory, but it sort of that suggests the question: well, which one of us is doing the right thing, or are we both doing the right thing in our particular narrow areas? You could make that claim. I don't know. It's just there seem to be a lot of connections there that would be worth exploring.
Yeah, it's definitely something I would have to think about more.
All right, well, we're almost out of time, so I'm going to go ahead, and we don't have any questions. So I'm going to go ahead and there's a band playing outside my window. So I'm going to go ahead and end the seminar a couple of minutes early. I want to thank Sarah for appearing today. I also want to advertise next week's talk. So next week, October 21st at noon Eastern Time, we will host a talk by Jacob Montgomery of Washington University in St. Louis. We'll be advertising his talk through our various outlets next week, but you can check out our website, www.methods-colloquium.com, to get more information about the upcoming talk and the rest of our schedule for the 2016 academic year. Sarah, thanks for appearing on the IMC today.
Thank you so much.
All right, I'll see everybody next week.